we are going to be talking about Shiny. So this is a big topic, um, and it can be a little bit intimidating, but it's a really fun topic too. And so hopefully it's more on the fun side and not the intimidating side as we get going here. So when you're building Shiny apps, there's sort of two main things that you have to keep in mind. One is the UI, which stands for user interface, and the other is the server, which is where everything actually computes and happens. Okay. There's also a Shiny template that you can use that we'll get to that is really nice in terms of like starting out and having a very basic Shiny app. Okay. So the learning objectives for today are be able to create basic interactive plots with Shiny. So this slideshow is kind of the opposite of what I just said for my data visualization one. We only have 20 slides, and we probably still won't even get through all 20 of those slides. So this is going to be very interactive today, and I'm hoping it's almost like a guided lab almost. Okay, so it will be very much like I'm asking you to do something, you work on it for a bit, then I show you how to do it. Then I ask you how to do something else, you work on it for a bit, then I show you how to do it. Okay, so the learning objectives for today are be able to create basic interactive plots with Shiny and understand basic layouts. The understand basic layouts part is sort of secondary. We're going to talk about that more on Wednesday. So if we don't get through all of that part, that's okay. The main part is being able to sort of understand how the UI and the server work together and be able to use that to create some basic interactive plots. Okay. So this is just an obligatory Shiny meme because if you've seen Moana, you can't help but think of I can't even remember his name now. Tamatua. My wife just shouted at me from the other room. So especially if you're a parent, Tamatua always comes to mind. Okay, so the basics. We are going to all do this now. Okay, so this is what I'd like you to do. I will actually run through it first, and you can watch me, and then I'm going to give you a minute to do it too. Okay, but you can do it actually at the same time as me. What we're going to do is we're going to create a new R project, and as we do that, we're going to say we want a Shiny web application. Okay. Then we're going to select the directory that we want the folder to be stored in and click Create Project. Okay, so let me go to RStudio. And let me adjust the size of this so that hopefully it will match kind of. All right, so when you're creating projects, right, there's a bunch of different ways to do it, but I usually just click this little icon here. That will bring up this. Do you see this new project wizard thing? Or do I need to? You can see that. Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
All right. So then we'll go new directory. And then instead of just saying new project like we normally do, we'll say Shiny web application. Okay. And that's pretty much the only difference. Then from here, we're going to create a directory. So this is saying in the desktop, I'm going to call it my first app, whatever. You can call it whatever you want to call it. Okay, you could create it with a Git repository as well if you want. You will, if you're doing big applications, you will probably want to use Renv. I'm not going to for this specific application. All right, Renv, we're never really going to talk about in class, but you can go, it's put out by RStudio too. You can go and look at the website if you're interested in that. It's a package management system. So that means basically it'll take a snapshot of all of the packages that you're using in your Shiny application and the specific version that you're using, and it will sort of freeze that state. So it's like this lock file. And so anytime anybody's ever trying to use your app, it will always download those specific packages and those specific versions so you know your app should always work. Okay, so that's a good thing to do, but it introduces a few more complications that I just don't really want to get into today. All right, but I would encourage you to explore that on your own later. Okay, then we're going to create project, and it should look like this. So you can see we have my first app.rproj and we have app.r. Okay, So we can open up app.r and you can actually just right away click run app, and this is a basic little web application. Okay, so go ahead and do all of that. And I'll give you a minute or so to do that. Give me a thumbs up emoji when you're done there. All right. So now the first thing I would like you to do is just run the app. Once you run it, you can look at it in the little RStudio preview thing. I tend to like to click the button that will open it up in my web browser. Okay. So then from there, I'm going to give you a little bit of time. I'll put you in breakout groups, and then I would like you all to run it, and then I'll start the clock after you're in your breakout groups. But run it and then kind of look at the code and see if you can kind of deduce what's going on in terms of how the app itself is working. Okay, so I'm going to open up let me actually real quick switch my share and show you what I mean about bringing it to a web app. So I'll put this here. So I'm sharing two things. Okay, so here we can click run app. That's going to open a little preview thing, and I'm going to have to share that too. So that'll look like this. If I can see it, managing all my windows. Do you see this now, the little preview thing? Okay, so then there's just this button here, open in browser. Okay, and you can do that, and then that'll open it over here in the browser, and then you can play with it there. Okay. When we're looking at this code, right, you can see that it has, and let me actually go to the code as well. We have this UI that is being defined here, right? And we have this server that's being defined here, okay? So these are the two main things that I mentioned before. So the UI defines the way that the Shiny app is going to end up looking, right? It's like the look and the feel of the app. It also defines the inputs to the server, okay? So the server is where everything is rendering, is computing, right? So if you're, say, creating a table and you need to do some summary calculations, then it will do those calculations there. Your UI then says group by this variable, and that will switch the thing that it's now computing by. It will do that calculation again, and then it will go back to the UI. So the UI is where the output lives, okay? So UI is sort of where everything that you're computing in the server is going to live in your app, right? Where it's going to be, but it also defines the inputs. So for example, as I just mentioned, if you're having a table that's grouping by one variable and you have 5 different variables you want it to possibly group by, you could have 5 different choices in your UI. Those then get fed to your server, and it sort of interactively swaps out what variable is being used in the group by. Okay. So in this case, for this application, we have a slider input. Okay. So that's right here. We have a slider input, and it's called bins. Okay. This is the title of that slider input, number of bins. So this slider input takes the values 1 as its minimum, 50 as its maximum, and it starts at a value of 30. Okay, that's what that value equals means. That's where it's going to start. These then get passed to the server down here through this input $bins. Okay, so in Shiny, input is sort of a specialized thing in the server that is whatever the input from the UI is. Okay, so we have input is just this general thing that's always going to exist in the server, and it comes from the UI. In this case, we're using $sign to grab the bins, which is what we're defining here. Okay, so bins ends up being, in this case, just a vector that ranges from 1 to 50. Okay, and then that value, whatever value is supplied, goes in here. Okay, and now working through this is a little bit more complicated because we're using base code, which we're probably not super familiar with. but this is just computing the number of bins to use, and then that's being passed to the breaks argument in hist. Okay, so when inputs is 1, then length.out is going to be 2, right? Input bins plus 1. When it's 50, it's going to be 51, etc. Okay, and this is creating a sequence from the minimum of x to the maximum of x. X is just the second column of faithful. So if I come down here and I just say head faithful, faithful is a data set that comes with base R, right? And it has these eruptions from Old Faithful, from Yellowstone, right? And then this waiting time between interruptions, I think. Okay. And so we're looking at a histogram of waiting. Okay, and all we're doing with the bins is setting the bin width here. Does that make some sense? And then it lives up here in the sidebar panel. Well, that's where the slider input is. And then the actual output is here. Okay, so just like the UI has the input, in the server, we're always going to be defining outputs. So there's going to be different parts of that output. So we're going to have output $, and then we just define what that new thing is that we're calling it. So I'm calling this dist plot. Well, I'm not calling it. That's what the template is calling it, which then gets passed up here where we want that thing to render. Okay, so we're saying in the main panel, use plot output and use dist plot. Okay, so if I change this thing to be dist underscore plot, then I would just change this to be dist underscore plot and it would work. Okay, similarly for the input, if I called this in bins, then I could just down here change this to in bins and it would work. Okay, so it doesn't matter what you call those things as long as you're consistent and they're talking to each other that way. Okay, and when I run this app now, it should look exactly the same. And I know I'm not sharing my screen, but it does look exactly the same and it works. Okay. So that's the UI, the server. I've sort of already talked about this, but the server takes input from the UI and it uses it to basically use normal R code. Okay. This may not look totally like normal R code because it's base R and we haven't used base R a lot, but it is just base R code. Okay. So we're creating one output object called distplot, and then that result is going to the UI on line 30 to say, put that output here. Okay. So what I'd like you to do now is try removing lines 39 to 44 right here, right? And then just try, say, print input bins. All right. Just go ahead and do that as we're all here together. It seems like this should work, right? But it's not actually working, right? So if I do this, I'll do this with you. This is what I was asking for, right? I'm going to delete all of this, or you could comment it out, but I'll just delete it and say print input bins. That should just echo whatever the bins is that I'm passing it, right? But when I say run app, you can see this now, right? Yeah, okay. This is what it looks like. So my slider's working, but I'm not getting any output. If you look at this code, look at the server and the UI, do you see anything there that might make you think why that is happening?
Is it because in the UI part, it's saying plot output, but you're not providing a plot?
Yes, that's exactly what it is. So here we're saying plot output, but we need, I think it's just text output. And similarly, I can check here. Yes, text output. And similarly down here, instead of saying render plot, we need to say render text. Okay. So the thing that you're rendering, it needs to expect that specific kind. So in this case, we're rendering text rather than a plot. So we need to say render text rather than render plot. and then the output is going to be text output instead of plot output. Okay, and so now when I run that, open browser, it's still not working. Why is it not working now? Oh, because I changed this to n bins. That's why. So change this to n bins. Now we reload and now it works. All right, so there it is. Okay, whatever you put in your bins, it's just going to echo that over there. Okay, does that kind of make some sense? All right. So it should work now. Is it not working for anybody? Okay, good. So now I have a pretty big challenge for you. So I'm giving you 10 full minutes for it. What would you prefer? Do you want to do this in your breakout groups, or do you want to just do this individually? How about this? I'll open up breakout rooms. You can go there if you want. If you want to just stay in the main room, you can do that, okay? But what I'd like you to do is I would like you to try to rewrite the code so that instead of using base R code, you are going to use ggplot, okay? So I will tell you one thing you should start out with is by saying library ggplot to up there, okay? Because you're going to need to load that library for your app to work. Okay, so that's all we're doing, right? So reminder, the data are called faithful, and we want to show the distribution of weighting, and we want to be able to vary the bin width for that. Okay, so give it a try. This is how I would do it, all right? I would actually start by creating a new script where I can just work freely and not worry about the Shiny app, okay? Then I'd say library ggplot 2, and then I would, oops, hang on. And then I would look at the faithful data set, and it looks like this. So, okay, now I'm going to create one singular histogram. All right, so I'll just say ggplot faithful AES weighting plus geom histogram. All right, cool, there's a histogram. So that's good. Now it says using bins equals 30, pick a better value. Okay, well, that's actually what I want to change, right? So I'll just say bins equals, I'll say 10. Cool, that works. Bins equals 50. That works. All right, so that's all I have to do. So I'm going to take this, I'm going to copy it, move over here, and I'm going to go down here to my server output, and I'm going to put that code there. Okay, the only thing I'm going to do differently now, though, is I'm going to change this number from 50 to being whatever the input is that's passed to it. Okay, so I'll say input $, and then I changed mine to nbin. Okay, the other thing that I need to make sure is that I have this set up right. So right now I have it still set as render text, but I need to change that back to render plot like we had it before. Similarly, up here I have text output. I want that to be plot output. Okay, and then I double check that I have dist plot and dist plot. Yep, those things match, so that's good. And I have in bin and in bins. So see, that wasn't right. So in bins. Okay, so that is going to be there. Okay, and now this is going to be a slider that takes the values from 1 to 50 and starts at 30. All right, so now I can run the app, save selected, and I will open it over here, and voila, there we go. We've got the same histogram we had before, but using ggplot now. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, so there's the demo. All right, let's say now, instead of having a slider that goes from values of 1 to 50, we want to change this so we have just select discrete options. Okay, those options are going to be 1, 5, 20, 50, or 100. Okay, I don't even know if we have 100 data points, but that's what we're going to be changing the bin width to. Okay, so there's multiple ways we can do this, but probably the easiest is we can change the input from a slider that's going to slide to any value to radio buttons, which are just clicking discrete choices. Okay, we could also do a drop-down menu or something like that, which would be select input. But this time, all we're going to do is change slider input to radio buttons. Okay, now if you're like me, you probably can't remember always the arguments to these things. So you can just do !radio, and then you can bring up the help documentation for it. So radio buttons, input ID is going to be first. We're going to keep that as in bins. The label is going to be second. We're going to keep that as number of bins. But then from there, we now have choices. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of all of that. I'm going to change this from slider input to radio buttons. And then I'm going to say choices equal, and then I just give it a vector of choices. Okay, 1, 5, 20, 50, 100. Okay, and then there's also this selected, which will say what are we going to start it out at. Okay, so I'll say selected equals 20. Okay, so that's where we're going to start. Okay, now I can run the app. And now it looks like this. Notice it starts at 20, and we can just click buttons to change how it looks. Okay? Make sense? Do you want to give that a try? Give you another 30 seconds or so to see if you can get that to work on your end. And then give me a thumbs up if you've gotten it to work. So this is just reiterating. So you can keep working if you haven't finished it yet. But all we're going to do is just change slider input to radio buttons, and then we're going to put our choices and a selected argument. Okay, so you can try it out. We've already kind of done that. All right, more complicated. Let's say we wanted to build a plot that showed the distribution. So we're going to switch data sets here. Okay, we're going to go to the MPG data set. So this is the MPG data set comes with ggplot. So if you have ggplot loaded, it should work for you. Okay, so type MPG and it looks like this. It's different than empty cars, but it's basically the same sort of thing, right? So let's say we wanted to build a plot that showed the distribution of highway miles per gallon. That's going to be this, well, it's over here, HWY column. Okay, highway miles per gallon that could be faceted by year, trans, and class. So we're going to show a histogram of highway miles per gallon, but it's going to be faceted by these variables, year, trans, class. Okay, so those are 3 different variables that it could be faceted by. Let's say you also want to keep that slider in there so that people can adjust the bin width. Okay, so you could use radio buttons for the variables, okay, and slider input for the bins. Okay, you'll also need to create a second entry in your UI. So right here, we have main panel, we have plot output dist plot, right? But we only have one thing that's being passed to it. So right now we have radio buttons, but we could change that back to slider input for our bin width, right? But we're going to have a second one of these up here for the variables. Okay, so all we'll do for that is just do a comma, and then you can say radio buttons or whatever, and change this one back to slider input. Okay, and then you'll use the MPG data set as well. Okay, so let's actually try this. I know this is kind of a lot, but I'll give you 5 minutes since we didn't take it here. I'll give you 5 minutes to try to just do this. Okay, so you're going to add a second one here, and then you're going to change this plot so that it shows the distribution of highway miles per gallon, but then it's faceted by one of these three variables. Does that make sense? And still has the control over the bin width. Okay, any questions on that? Okay, let's give that a try. All right, so I would do this again, just like I kind of mentioned before. I would start over here, and I would try to sort of build up my base plot that I want. Okay, so I have MPG, and I'm going to call ggplot on that. And then I'm going to say, yes, I want HWY on the x-axis. And then I'm going to say plus geom histogram. That gives me the basic histogram. And then I want to be able to facet that by different variables, right? So facet wrap by, let's say, trans. Okay, so that does that. That's good. And then here, I just want to do the same thing as before, bins equals 10, maybe. Okay, so that works. So that's cool. One thing that is important to notice, though, is facet wrap also works like this. If I say trans and I just pass it like that, that will also work. Okay, so I don't have to use the tilde. I could also pass it as a string. Okay, so that's important to know for this specific problem, because that makes the code down here that we write quite a bit easier. Okay, so I can just basically pass that same code. I don't know why my indenting gets messed up here. On bins, I'm going to change that again to input $in bins. And then here for facet wrap, I can just change it to whatever I'm going to call the thing in the UI. And I haven't defined it yet, but I'll just make up something now, right? So I'll call it input var, right? The variable that I want to facet by. Okay. Now up here, I need for my radio buttons, right? I'm going to say var. That's the thing I'm going to create. The label is going to be select a variable to facet by, maybe. Okay. And then we'll say choices are equal to, and then we'll just feed it a character vector, year, trans, and class. And then we don't have to actually say selected because it'll just do the first one by default, I'm pretty sure. But I'll just do it anyway. We'll say selected equals class when we start there instead of at year. Okay. Then up here for my slider input, I need to redefine this. So I'm going to say min equals 1, max equals 50, it's not value equals 30. Okay. So that should all work now because we have var here, which is being passed there. And we have in bins here, which is coming from there. All right. So let's try it out. And notice it still says Old Faithful geyser data, so we should probably change that. But otherwise, it looks like it's working. It's starting at class, it's starting at 30. If I change this, that changes. So that's great. And then I can try the other variables, and that works as well. Okay? So we have now fairly quickly built a pretty nice interactive plot. Now, obviously the data is boring and we don't care about it, but we have created a fairly complex interactive plot in not a whole lot of code, right? Up here, this is where that Old Faithful geyser data is on the title panel. So I'll change this to MPG data from boring ggplot to default. Okay, now rerun it. And now we have this. Okay. And of course, we could do theming and all of that kind of stuff too. Any questions on that? Okay, tables. If you're going to include tables in a Shiny app, my recommendation would be to either use data table from the DT package or reactable from the reactable package. Okay, we talked more about reactable last term than we did data table. Either one of them work. I tend to like reactable more. That's why I talked about it last time. So let's build a table that's going to go below our plots, okay, that has the mean, standard deviation, min, and max of the corresponding distributions, okay? So we'll need to create a new output object in the server that creates this table. And then in the UI, we'll need to say where that table actually should exist, okay? When we're doing this, we're going to use render data table in the server, okay, or render reactable, whichever one you end up using, okay? So for example, down here, we're using render plot. If you have reactable as your output that's coming from that thing, then it should say render reactable instead of render plot, okay? And then similarly up here, rather than having plot output, we would put data table output or reactable output, okay? And again, we're going to do this just by putting a comma and then, reactable output. Notice it didn't come up in my autocomplete because I have not yet loaded reactable, okay? So when you're creating the table, you will probably want to use dplyr, okay? Because it's going to be a lot easier if we think about something like this, right? This is our plot that we have now. And what we want to do is create a plot that is grouped by this same thing, right? But then gives the means and standard deviations for and the min and max values for every one of these distributions. So we probably want to do something where we're saying, library dplyr, and then we would say mpg group by trans, and then summarize mean is equal to mean highway, and a.rm equals true, etc. Right? That's now a table that's going to give us the mean, min, max. I mean, we have to continue filling this out, but for each of these distributions. All right. Now, when we're doing this, that code is really nice, and that's what we're used to. But this is a perfect example of when we need to use non-standard evaluation if we're going to be using the tidyverse, okay? And in this case, it's not that hard once you know what it is, but if you didn't, you'd probably spend a lot of time trying to figure it out. So I'm just going to tell you what it is, all right? Input var, if we come back here, input var is just going to be a character vector, okay? So it's a character vector of the different variables that we could potentially facet by, all right? So what we're going to do is say we're going to change that character vector to a symbol, okay? So that's like a variable sort of thing. And then we're going to bang, bang to evaluate that, okay? So whatever the var is in here, we're going to first change that from a character to a symbol, and then we're going to evaluate it. Okay, so basically, this is one of those cases where that double curly braces is not going to get you out of jail, right? And so you have to actually use the rlang version. So you'd say bang bang sim, and because you're using that, you will also need to say library rlang. Okay, so assuming you're doing that. Okay, so we have a little bit of time, so I'm going to just go back to my same timer before. We'll set a timer for 5 minutes again and give that a try, see if you can get that to work, okay? Okay, so let's go ahead and try this. This is the basics of the table, right? But we're going to swap out the variable here, and then we want to add a few more things here. So I'll just copy this, and we'll say min, max, and then we have the mean, and then we're going to say SD. Okay, So there's our table, basically. That's the table that we want, but we want to swap out this, right? This variable. So we shouldn't have to change anything for our UI because we already have an input for that thing, right? So we're going to pull all of this over, and we're going to create a new output object. Okay, so I'll call this output $TBL for table. Okay, then I'll say render reactable. All right, notice this gives me a function, but I'm going to use curly braces so I can define what's happening in there. Okay, then I'll just paste that same code that I had. I'm going to bring this back a bit. Oops, a little too far. Okay, and that's looking good. The only thing is I need to change this part. Instead of trans, it should be input var. But remember, that is going to be a character string variable vector. So I can't actually group by trans in quotes, right? So I would need to say bang bang and then sim there. Okay. Now, last thing, I still need to pipe that to reactable, right? And that will actually now give me a reactable table, right? Up here, I haven't yet loaded the plier, so I need to do that too. Okay, and then down here, I have plot output displot, and now I'm going to say reactable output TBL. Okay, does that make sense? This should all work now. We have table here, table there, right? Output table, and render reactable output, render reactable. So displot, input var, input imbins, input var, all should work. Okay, let's give it a try. And it looks like this. So we have our table here. That looks good. We can switch what we're grouping by, and you can see both the table and the plots change. We can change the number of bins too, but that's not going to change the table. It'll only change the plot. Okay? Questions on that? Make sense? So now we have not only an interactive plot, but actually a table that corresponds with that plot that is also changing interactively in the same way that the plot is. All right. Okay, last thing for today. We only have like 10 more minutes. So we'll try to get through this first part of this. Let's say instead of having the table below the plot, we wanted to have tabs. Okay, so we have a tab that has the plot and a separate tab that has the table. Okay, so this is now layouts. So we've gone from trying to figure out how these inputs and outputs work, the UI with the server, to now we're going to change just how the layout of the final thing actually looks. Okay, so if we want to do that within the main panel, we're going to create a thing called tab set panel. Okay, then within that tab set panel, we're going to add a tab panel for each tab. Okay, so demo is supposed to be down here. So this is going to look like this. Server is going to stay exactly the same. Okay, because remember, the server is where everything computes, but the UI is where it defines the look and feel. All right, so within main panel right here, I'm going to say, you can see, like, I don't know why it switches to 4 spaces with Shiny, because I have it set to 2. Anyway, you can see that like this starts to get really busy here, right? And so there are ways around that we'll talk about more, but you have to be very careful about where which parentheses are matching up with which ones, because as your app gets more and more complicated, this just gets really complicated. Okay, so there are ways that you can sort of refactor your code so you don't have to deal with this quite so much, but it's continually a challenge to me anyway. All right, so within the main panel, we're going to say tab set panel. Okay, and then within that, we're going to say tab panel. Okay, the first thing that you can see with tab panel right here is the title. Okay, so I'm going to call this plots. Okay, and then within that tab panel, I'm going to put my plot output. Okay, then I'll create another tab panel, and I'm going to call this one table. Okay, and that's going to be my reactable table. Okay, so now this is what I was just referring to in terms of getting lost in the parentheses. This parenthesis here goes to tab panel. This one here goes to main panel. This one here goes to sidebar layout. And this one here finally goes to the UI, or to the fluid page, which is sort of the whole UI. Okay, so let's try this now. All we've done is modify the UI. We haven't done anything to the server, so our app should fundamentally be the same thing, but it's just going to look a little different. Okay, so when I open this up now, you can see we have plots, and we can click on this and do all of this, and that all looks the same. And then we can click on table, and now we get the table. Okay, so otherwise it's the exact same, but we've just changed the layout a little bit. Does that make sense? Okay. An alternative is, instead of using tab set panel, you could create a navbar, okay, at the top of the page. So you can use Navbar Page instead. Okay, this is a little bit more complicated, okay, because tab set panel just goes inside your main panel. Okay, in this case, when you're using Navbar Page, you're actually wanting separate pages for your app, which means that you need to have everything defined in there. So you need the sidebar panel, you need a main panel, etc., for each navbar page. Okay, so each tab from the navbar becomes an entirely new page, but also sort of confusingly, we're gonna say navbar page and then app title, but we're also still going to say tab panel to define each page. Okay, so let's try this really quick. We have like 7 minutes left. Hopefully this works. I may fail here, but we'll give it a try. All right, so I'll say, in fact, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy all of this, right? And I'm going to just open a new R script and just paste it in there so I have it so I can refer back to it. Okay, then I'm going to say, all right, get rid of this. I'll say Navbar Page, and the title will be, let's see, what is, we'll call it plots. Okay, I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to take all of this stuff up to here, and I'm going to put it inside of that. Okay, and then I'm going to add that there. Okay, so this should correspond with that, and it does. Okay, so then I'm going to pull out the table part, and I'm going to pull out this tab set panel part and the tab panel part. Okay, and I'll just leave that there for now. Usually I would try to fix these so they're a little more clear, but well, yeah, actually I need to do this. So this is corresponding to sidebar layout. So this one's going to, let's see, main bar panel. No, I need, this one goes to main bar panel. That's why. Okay, So that's main bar panel. This should go to sidebar layout, navbar page. Okay, so that's good. And then, oh shoot, what do I have to do here though? Navbar page, I think this is actually going to say, this is where I'm going to put this. I'm going to delete this also. And then I'm going to just say, oops. I'm going to say, why does it go clear over there? All right, so then I'm going to say tab panel. And then this is where I say plots. I think that's right. And if not, well, then it's not. And I'll figure it out later and show you an example. All right, let's just try that far and see if that works. Okay, so I think it is working. Okay, this is plots. That's cool. Here's our thing. Now what we're gonna do is right here, navbar page, that's good, but I need a new tab panel in here. Okay, so I'm gonna put a comma here, and notice this is really important that you keep these parentheses correct, because this one is going with tab panel, and that's what I want to do. I want to create a new tab panel. Okay, so here I'll say tab panel. All right, and then inside of there, I'm going to just, oops, yeah, that's what I want. I'm going to just copy all this again, but I'm going to call this tab panel table. Okay, paste all that in there again, and then this time I'm going to get rid of all of this same sort of stuff as I did before, but I'm going to keep the table in there. Okay, so that goes there. Deleted. Where's that one? Sidebar layout. Okay, so this is going sidebar layout, and then this should be tab panel. Yes, this one should be navbar page. It is. And so then finally we've got our fluid row. So you can see this is a ton of parentheses that we're having to manage, right? And so hopefully this will work now. And it does. So at least it does for the plots still. And then if we click on table, yes, it's there. Okay. Oh, but I forgot about this part. Even though we're using the exact same thing here, right? In this second one, in this second tab panel for the table, we can take out this slider input, right? We don't need that anymore. We only need the radial buttons because that's the only thing that is varying. But we would probably want to call this var2, okay? And then down here, we would say var2, okay? And even though that thing is the exact same as var up here, we need to have them as separate things because they're on separate pages and it doesn't want to communicate across pages. Okay, so let's try that again. Here's this. Let's make sure this is working. Yes, make sure that works. Yes. Okay, now for the table, we have only this, and yes, now it's working. Okay, so that's a lot of complicated parentheses. But conceptually, it's still the same sort of stuff that we had before, all right? And so this is where I mentioned a bunch of times, like managing those parentheses can often be one of the most challenging parts of Shiny because this is a relatively complicated example, but it's not really that complicated if you think about like a real full web page, web app in production, right? So what you can do is you can modularize your code. So you can write these things called Shiny modules, which are each little kind of component, and then you can bring those in. So hopefully by the end, we'll have enough time to talk about those. But that's sort of a more advanced feature. I'm also hoping that we'll talk about reactivity, which is sort of a different way of writing Shiny code. But this is sort of the basics of Shiny. Okay, so we got through everything that I was hoping to get through today, which is good. This is just sort of some conclusions. So I mentioned the Shiny modules thing. This is the link that talks about that. There's also the Mastering Shiny book, which I have linked in the syllabus and things too. This is a newer book. It actually just came out in print like this month, I think. So, but it's a really good book. It's kind of interesting because Hadley wrote that book, but Hadley actually had nothing to do with Shiny. That was Joe Chang. Hadley's just a good writer, and Joe didn't want to write the book, so Hadley did. But it's a good book. I haven't been able to fully dig into it yet, but I'd recommend using that as you go deeper, and definitely take a look at Shiny modules as you build out more complicated apps. Okay, so next time we'll continue to talk about these layouts and things, but I'll also introduce Shiny dashboards. Okay, any questions for the end of today?
Can we get your script here for the final? Because I followed until this last portion and would like to have it.
Yeah, sure. I'll post that on the repo. I'll put it in the scripts folder.
Thanks.
Yep. Okay, any other questions? All right. I will see you Wednesday. Also, real quick on final projects, remember that you need a repo for your final project by Wednesday. It doesn't have to be complete, but it should be in progress. And then all assigned peer reviews. So please, as soon as you can, send me your repo so I can get together the peer review assignments and have actual links to everybody's repos. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. I'll see you Wednesday.